Hello and welcome back to my series, Facts, Values, and Flourishing. I'm Craig Biddle, and we're going to continue today talking about how it is that values or principles of morality are derived from facts of reality, from observation and logic. Last week we talked about the nuts and bolts of this derivation, and we followed Ayn Rand's approach to this, where we looked at reality to figure out what are values and do we need them, and if so, why do we need them? And we traced Rand's thinking through a series of observations and integrations to arrive at the conclusion, the logically derived conclusion, that only life makes values possible and only life makes values necessary. It's only the existence of life that makes the pursuit of values possible, and it's only the continuation of life that makes the pursuit of values necessary. In order to pursue values, something has to be alive, and in order to remain alive, that thing has to pursue and achieve the values that sustain it. And this idea, which had many more steps, but that's the basic idea. This idea is what gives rise to the idea, the principle, that life is the standard of value. And it's the standard of value for any living organism, whether it's a tree or a mouse or a tiger or a whale. And it gives rise to the same principle for human beings, that human life is the standard of value for human beings. So it's the standard of moral value. When we get to human beings in this observation of the way that things are in nature, we see that human beings have free will. We can choose to focus our mind or not. We can choose our actions. We can choose our values. And so we don't have automatic values. We don't automatically pursue life-serving values as other animals do. We can actually choose to act against our values, against our life-serving values. We can pursue anti-life values. We can even embrace a moral code that advises us to pursue anti-life values. So we need to not only see that life is the standard of value, but we also need to understand what life is for man. We need to understand what is the life of this kind of animal. And that's what we're going to be talking a lot about in the coming episodes of this. We're just going to keep fleshing that idea out. It's going to be a cumulative and integrative investigation as we go. Today, I want to focus on a few immediate implications of the ideas that we've already discussed, and some of them are relatively controversial, and then we'll turn to some objections to Rand's derivation of life as the standard of value, and look at about four major objections that I think are the most substantial ones that people have come up with. If you happen to have objections that I don't cover today, feel free to submit them and I'll discuss them in a future episode when we do a Q&A. So the main thing I want to focus on today is the implications of this idea that life is the standard. And as we proceed, it's good to bear in mind this two-pronged principle, because this is really the key to this whole thing. It's really the linchpin of this whole idea that life is the standard of value. Only life makes values possible, and only life makes values necessary. There is no other alternative in the world that is so fundamental that it makes values possible and necessary. It's the existence of life that lays this foundation, and it's only the existence of life. And every other alternative that we face in reality, whether to go to school today or not, whether to go surfing today or not, whether to have a career or a job, or to rob banks and defraud people, all of these other alternatives in life they exist, but they're not fundamental. They don't make life possible, right? Life makes all of those alternatives possible. So life is the fundamental alternative. Life or death is the fundamental alternative that living things face. And this fundamentality of this idea is what makes life the standard of value. If there were something that life was in service of, rather than the actions that we take being in service of life, then we would have to dig deeper. We'd have to say, well, what is that thing? But when we get to the bottom of our inquiry, what we find is that indeed life is the ultimate alternative. Life or death is the ultimate alternative, and life, therefore, is the ultimate value. It's the value that all of our actions should work toward. Now, the should comes in again because we're dealing here in morality. Other animals automatically pursue life-serving values. Human beings do not automatically pursue life-serving values. So we need to take this principle that life is the standard of value, bring it up to the conceptual level in morality and say, okay, this is what we should do, is take actions and think in ways that can project the requirements of human life so that we can live fully as human beings, right, with respect to our material and spiritual requirements, our physical and psychological needs, not only for a moment or a day, but for years and decades. So this is what we aim to do. Now, an interesting thing about Ayn Rand's discovery that life is the fundamental alternative is that we see that the very concept of value depends on the concept of life. There's a hierarchical dependency here, right? Life is the fundamental, life exists, and because it exists, values both become possible and necessary, right? And therefore, and this is just a metaphysical fact that living things are what give rise to the possibility and need of values. That's just a metaphysical fact. Ayn Rand points out an epistemological corollary of this, and that is that to speak of values as apart from life is to do something that's actually worse than a contradiction in terms. It's worse than a contradiction to speak of values as apart from life. Now, why does she say it's worse than a contradiction? Well, Ayn Rand was very focused on the nature of concepts, the meaning of concepts, and the hierarchical derivation of ideas and what underlies a given idea. So what she's pointing out here is that the very idea of values is dependent on life for the very reasons that we've seen. And therefore, to speak of values as if they were not in some way attached to and dependent on and in service of life is to steal the concept of value away from its, to rip that concept away from its roots, away from its genetic roots that both give meaning to the concept and even give rise to the concept. We just simply wouldn't even have the concept of value if it weren't for life and the requirements of life. So there's a kind of a logical fallacy here that Ayn Rand has put her finger on. It's a new fallacy that she identified. She was the first to point this out. That if you tear a concept away from the foundational context of other concepts and ideas that give rise to this concept, you're committing a fallacy, and it's the fallacy of concept stealing. So it's absolutely logically improper to rip this idea of value away from life. And that's because, as we've seen, life is the very thing that gives rise to the need and possibility of values. So that's another sort of anchoring element that is extremely important to understand here. Now, that's an epistemological, this has to do with knowledge and concepts, this point. And it's really not the fundamental. The fundamental is the metaphysical fact that only living things can pursue values and only living things need to pursue values. That's the fundamental. But this epistemological corollary, that to tear the idea of value away from the idea of life, is actually worse than a contradiction. It's a stolen concept. It sort of undermines the very idea of values and or rips that idea away from the context that gives rise to it and that gives it meaning. Another very important point of all of this is that, and I'm going to return now to the question that we looked at last week, and that is the idea that a value presupposes an answer to the question to whom and for what, right? And we looked at, well, if a tiger is chasing a wild boar, the wild boar is a value to whom? To the tiger. And then for what? And we looked further and we realized that the ultimate what for, or the ultimate for what here, is life. It's for the life of that tiger. And this holds true for animals and plants and for people. When we get to human beings, again, we're dealing with volition. And so we have this standard of value, which is our life. And the values that we pursue are values to us and for us, right? To whom and for what? Values are to me. If I'm pursuing a career, that career is a value to me. And it is a value for what? For my life. Okay, now this is all very logical, but here's where it gets a little bit controversial. Human beings are individuals, each with our own body, our own mind, our own life. And we pursue our values properly, according to this theory, based on observation and logic. Properly, we pursue our values for our lives. In other words, the idea of egoism, the principle of egoism, the idea that you should pursue life-serving values and that you're the proper beneficiary of the values that you pursue, comes straight out of this very idea that life is the standard of value, and that value presupposes an answer to the question, to whom and for what. Egoism just flows logically right out of this. So we see that there's a scientific grounding for the idea that people should pursue their values, and that when they pursue their values, those values should be in service of their own lives. Now, importantly, egoism is not the same thing as hedonism or subjectivism. There's a very, very important distinction between these, and so I want to focus on that for a minute. Egoism is anchored in this idea that life is the standard of value. And so it's not holding the idea that happiness is the standard of value, or feelings are the standard of value, or pleasure is the standard of value. Now, happiness, feelings, and pleasure are all perfectly good and normal and natural things, and we're going to talk about what they are and what the importance of those is. But they are not the objective foundation of the very idea of value. Life is. Life is what gives rise to the possibility and need of values. It is not happiness that does that. It is not pleasure that does that. It is not feelings that do that. What does it is life. That's it. And egoism holds life as the standard of value, whereas hedonism holds pleasure as the standard of value. That which is gives you pleasure is good. Well, this again is circular, because if something gives you pleasure, you've already evaluated it as good on some level. So where did the evaluation come from? What's the objective fact of reality that you're referring to say that this thing is good, or to have the emotion that it's good? If I watch a movie and it gives me pleasure, and I say, well, that's good, okay, but what is it about that movie, and what facts of reality anchor that pleasure in an objective fact? If it's just my feelings, then everything is subjective. This makes you happy, robbing banks makes this guy happy, raping people makes that guy happy. There's no objectivity there. There's just feelings. There's just whatever gives you pleasure. So hedonism is really just a kind of a form of subjectivism. It's the idea that whatever makes you feel a certain way is good. That is not what's going on with egoism at all. Now, there is a very important relationship between life and happiness, and Ayn Rand talks about this, and she puts it essentially this way. The pursuit of life and the pursuit of happiness are not two entirely separate things. They're two very similar things. In fact, they're two aspects of the same aim. One is more fundamental than the other, though. So the aim is to live as a human being, to pursue the values that are appropriate and necessary for the kind of animal that you are. The standard of value is life. Whatever it promotes the life of the kind of being that you are, that is objectively the good. Now, if we do pursue the values that objectively support the life of the kind of animal we are, so that they account for our physical needs, our spiritual needs, our short-term needs, our long-term needs, all of the richness that constitutes the life of a human being. If we pursue those values, then the effect is that we are happy. we achieve a state of non-contradictory joy, as Rand would define happiness. And so the relationship is important. It's not that happiness is trivial or unimportant. Happiness is extremely important. But the way that you can understand what happiness objectively is and what it should be in the sense of what gives rise to this feeling in a human being, if the human being is acting in his actually proper manner, given the kind of animal that he is, then we see the relationship between the two. But if you take happiness and rip it away from life, then you're ripping values away. I go after these things because I like them, but you're ignoring this life idea down here. You're ignoring the fundamental that even gives rise to the possibility or need of values, or the possibility or need of happiness. So life is the fundamental, it's the standard of value. Happiness is the ultimate goal of living, the ultimate goal. So we're alive, and what do we want to do while we're alive? We want to achieve happiness. We want happiness given the kind of animal that we are. And so a huge part of morality is figuring out, if life is the standard of value, and it is, what do we need to do given the kind of thing that we are to achieve happiness, to achieve an integrated, non-contradictory joy over the course of our lives. And on this theory, the way to do that is to take the actions that are commensurate with, that are in accordance with the kind of animal that you are and the requirements of that kind of animal's life. We'll talk a lot more about happiness because we're going to have a whole episode or two talking about how to achieve happiness. So we're certainly not leaving that in the dust, but I wanted to be very clear about the difference between happiness and life in this model. They're very related, but one is more fundamental than the other. One is objectively the case that there's only one fundamental alternative in the universe: existence or non-existence, life or death. We're at that very fundamental level when we're talking about life or death. And then happiness is this thing that can arise from a living thing, or a human being's choices and actions, if he takes the right choices and actions, right? And we know that happiness is not easy or just the norm in life by looking around. You look around the globe, there are people starving all over the place in third world countries. There are people at war with each other, shooting each other, cutting each other's heads off, and so on, burning each other's villages down over whose God is the right God. If we come to first world countries and go to the very wealthy, we look out in Hollywood and there are people overdosing on drugs in their multi-million-dollar mansions because they're not happy, right? So it's not the case that happiness or going after the things that you want in life and just having a great life is easy. It's not. And the reason it's not easy for so many people is because they haven't covered this ground between what is the standard of value, what is the standard of right and wrong, and what does that mean, what does that imply for us given the kind of animal that we are, and what kinds of principles and actions should we embrace and undertake if we want to live and achieve happiness. So this is really what the whole field of ethics is about. It's about covering the normative ethics part that we're in here is what principles of action should we embrace in order to achieve this goal. I want to point out another really interesting implication of this derivation. So we've seen how Rand's ideas have bridged the is-ought gap. But there's another thing that Rand's ideas have done, and we're just starting to see the tip of it now. We're going to see a lot more of this as we go. But her idea here has also solved the problem of human sacrifice. Think about it. If life is the standard of value, and a living thing should pursue the values that promote his life, and if that's true for all living things, then is it the case that a person should sacrifice his values for other people, or for a god, or for the environment, or for nothing, as Immanuel Kant would have it, for duty's sake? Should somebody just sacrifice his values? Is that good? Well, it's becoming pretty clear that's not the case, right? So we're starting to see that there's a science that says, no, that's not what people should do. Now, what about predation? Does a person have a right to attack other people, rape them, steal their stuff, beat them up, murder them, or whatever? again, if life is the standard of value and the thing acting is an individual and he should act to promote his life, and if that's true of all individuals in this species, then it's pretty clearly the case, and we haven't gotten to the theory of rights that comes out of all of this. We'll get to that later. But it's starting to become pretty clear that if everyone should pursue his life-serving values, that there's no reason for anybody to be sacrificing anyone else. Human life doesn't require human sacrifice. We can live without, cutting each other's heads off, raping each other, stealing each other's stuff. And none of that is a requirement of life. The requirements of human life are thinking and producing and trading and those kinds of things, right? So there's a really, really rich thing going on here, as you can see. We've not only bridged the Azot gap, we're beginning to solve the very idea, the very problem of human sacrifice that has haunted human beings for eternity or forever. And that is this idea that, well, some people want to attack other people and rape, pillage, and plunder, and other people say, no, you shouldn't do that. You should give up your values and turn the other cheek and sacrifice for everyone and give all your stuff away, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a complete false alternative, the idea that you should sacrifice other people or that it's okay to sacrifice other people, or you have to sacrifice yourself, right? So sacrifice others versus sacrifice yourself is, on this view, a false alternative. There's a third alternative, the alternative of, hey, how about if everyone pursues his values and doesn't sacrifice his values, and he respects the fact that everyone else needs to do that same kind of thing and should be left free to do that. This is just a whole new way of looking at the world, and it's all based on this observation-based derivation of life as the standard of value. So I hope you're seeing how this is becoming interesting and how much there is here, because this is a massively powerful integration that Ayn Rand has made, and although it took a genius mind like Rand to figure this stuff out, it doesn't take a genius to understand it if we put our minds to the process of thinking through, well, what are the connections here, and does this make sense? So now what I want to do is I want to turn to some objections. So we've got this basic idea on the table now, and we've seen today how the idea that life is the standard of value sort of gives almost immediate rise to this point that egoism is true. If you're pursuing values and the values are valued to you and for your life, that's pretty much just pointing right at egoism, the idea that you should pursue your values and the values should promote your life, and that's what egoism says. So I'm going to talk about, I have 4 objections here that are fairly common, and I've got them stated in streamlined terminology here. So I'm going to put them on the table. I'm going to talk about them briefly. We'll get through these, and then I'll have a few words to say at the end. And then if you have objections that I don't cover today that you'd like me to address in the future, just send them in and we'll take a look. Okay, some people will say, well, look, you haven't derived morality. You have derived selfishness. You've come up with a justification for acting in your self-interest, but that's not morality. Morality, people will say, is sacrificing for others. That's what morality is. Morality means doing things for other people. It means living for others, right? And so you just have not derived morality. You've just derived selfishness, and you've skipped the whole problem we were trying to deal with. All right. So, and this is a fair objection given the context of knowledge that most of us have in our lives. I mean, we're raised to believe that morality equals self-sacrifice. That altruism, the idea that you should sacrifice for others, that's what being moral is, that is the equivalent of morality. It's as if the two are exactly the same thing. Well, Ayn Rand made a really important identification here as well. She said to treat altruism and morality as the same thing, as synonymous, is to commit another kind of fallacy. It's a fallacy that she called the fallacy of the frozen abstraction. And here's how you can think about this. Morality is a broad concept. Okay, and here again we see Rand going to the nature of things and the meaning of concepts. This is always very important in proper philosophic thinking, and Ayn Rand was very focused on this. So morality is this broad concept, And it subsumes, this concept subsumes several different kinds of things that are called morality, right? So there's Christian morality, there's altruism, there's hedonism. Hedonism is a morality that holds that, as we talked about earlier, it holds that pleasure is the standard of value. There's egoism, the morality that I'm advocating here, the idea that life is the standard of value. There's environmentalism, the idea that nature untouched by man is the standard of value. So there are all these different ideas that come under the umbrella principle of morality. And to take one of them, say altruism, and to bring it up and make it the equivalent of the whole thing, the equivalent of this entire umbrella concept, is to commit the fallacy that Ayn Rand called the frozen abstraction. You're freezing the abstraction of morality at the level of one of its constituents. Okay? You're making morality equal one of the things that comes under morality, and thereby freezing out all of the other possible moralities. Well, there are two different questions here. There's what are the various things that are vying for, are vying to say that this is the correct morality. Well, all of those are moral codes. Christianity has a moral code. Islam has a moral code. Altruism is a moral code. Hedonism is a moral code. There are all these different codes of morality. That's one question, is which things claim to be moralities, which things actually are intended to guide people's thoughts and choices and actions in life. If a body of ideas or a system of ideas does that, then it comes under the concept of morality. It's a morality of a certain kind. The remaining open question is which of these things that's vying to be morality, the correct morality, which one is right? Which one is supported by the facts of reality? That's a separate question. So there's morality as such, and then there's validated morality, or logically proven true morality, or however you want to put it. So it's not the case that Ayn Rand has just set morality aside and gone on to justify selfishness. She began her whole inquiry with the question, what is morality? And she said, well, it's a code of values to guide people's choices and actions. That's true of all the different kinds of moralities, okay? And then she asks the further and deeper question, well, do we need this thing? And if so, why? Do we need a code of values to guide our choices and actions? If we don't need it, we don't need it. If we do need it, then the reason we need it is going to help us understand what's the correct morality. And this is what we did last week. We started with that question, and then we focused on values, because that's the central concept in the definition of morality. Morality is a code of values to guide your choices and actions. And so that's how we got down into the very fundamental ideas that we did, and arrived at this idea that there's only one fundamental alternative in the universe: existence or non-existence, life or death, and so on. So it's not the case that Rand just ignored morality and went on to justify selfishness. She began with the concept of morality, asked what this thing is and whether we need it, and then she, through a process of observation and integration and logic, came to the conclusion that values are supposed to be, naturally are, and should be for man, in service of life. And so it's important to understand that concepts are relational things, and the concept of morality has to have all of these other codes of morality, all of these various codes of morality under it to make sense of the concept. That's what it is. It's this idea that captures the Christian and the altruist and the hedonist and all of these other codes. And then we have a later question, well, which one of these codes is correct? Which one is supported by the facts? That's a separate question. So don't freeze the concept of morality at the level of altruism. If you can prove that altruism is true, then you can say altruism is the correct morality. But the problem with that is there are no facts of reality that give rise to the need of human sacrifice. There's nothing about the nature of man that requires us to sacrifice. If we want to live, we need to pursue values, not give them up. If we don't want to live, then we don't need values at all. All right, so I hope that answers that idea, the idea that Rand has not derive morality, but has just justified self-interest. She has justified self-interest, but she did so by going to the fundamentals in morality and looking at what morality is and whether we need this thing, and if so, why. All right, another objection to Rand's derivation of life as the standard is that some people put it this way: some animals act in life-destroying ways. So doesn't this invalidate Rand's derivation of life as the standard? So there are various kinds of animals. I mean, bees will sometimes sting people or sting an animal who they feel is a threat, and then the loss of their stinger actually renders the bee dead, or the bee dies shortly thereafter. There are certain kinds of spiders that act in ways that are contrary to their life, so they take actions that actually harm them. There are, I think it's a praying mantis or some kind of bug that after having sex bites the head off of its mate, and so obviously the mate going for the sex, if his head is going to be bitten off in the process, this is not life-serving action, and there are these various kinds of instances. So the question is, doesn't this invalidate Ayn Rand's whole scientific approach, because she's looking out at nature and saying, well, look, living things act to gain and keep values? And the answer is no, it does not invalidate, because for a couple of reasons, but the two main reasons are this. First of all, when you look out at nature, you do see animals pursuing the values that support their life. That is, the vast majority of of actions that animals and plants take are in pursuit of values that support their lives. The fact remains that the only reason values can exist is because of living things, and the only reason that these living things need to pursue values is in order to stay alive. If they didn't pursue the values, they would die. Or if they pursue the wrong values, if they pursue life-harming values, they will die. So the fundamental alternative remains. Life or death is the fundamental alternative, existence or non-existence. And the only reason that a living thing needs to pursue values is in order to remain alive. And the only reason that a living thing can pursue values is because it is alive. So all of those facts remain. But the more important point is this. Ayn Rand did not begin her quest into the nature of values just out of the blue by looking at animals out in nature, right? She's not trying to figure out what animals in nature do. That's not the beginning of, or even the overarching purpose of her inquiry. Her inquiry began with the question, does man need morality? What is this thing? Does man need it? And if so, why? Okay? She's not looking initially out at nature. She's looking initially at man and asking the question, look, there's this long-standing idea that we need principles to guide our actions in life. Is it true that we need principles to guide our actions? That's where she starts. And the only reason that she turns to other animals and to plants to see what's going on in the world out there is because she's trying to answer this question about human beings. And she notes that other living things pursue values too. And then she asks, well, why do they pursue values? And that whole inquiry is where she derived, as we've seen, life as the standard of value. But the purpose of the inquiry was to answer the question, does man need values? Does man need morality? And if so, why? And the fact is that the only reason that man needs values is in order to live. The only reason that he can pursue values is because he's alive. So the fact that there are a few instances in nature where animals take actions that are contrary to their lives has no bearing whatsoever on this question, this initial question, or on the principle derived from it. All of the important facts remain. The only reason that things can pursue values is because they're alive, and the only reason that they need to is in order to live. So I think that it's an interesting objection because it seems to be scientifically contrary to something going on in Rand's derivation, or at least at first blush it seems to be. But it's not, because Ayn Rand's theory does not rely on every action of every animal ever taken being for the purpose of advancing the life of that animal. That may or may not be the case. If it's not, and there are ways you could argue that it is, because, and some biologists have, you could argue that when an animal takes an anti-life action, he's taking it because, given the kind of animal that he is, his species depends on him doing that, and therefore, since he's part of the species, this is advancing his life. And you can argue that way too. There's something sound about that way of arguing. But the more important point is that it doesn't matter if there are counterexamples out in nature. The vast preponderance of evidence shows that the reason that living things pursue values is in order to live, A. And B, the only reason that they can pursue values or need to pursue values is because they're alive and in order to stay alive. And all of that remains. Okay, number 3 objection. What if I don't want to act egoistically? What if I want to act as an altruist or as a predator? So the idea here is, well, can't I choose a different standard of value? You say life is the standard of value. What if I say self-sacrifice is the standard of value? Or stealing stuff from other people successfully is the standard of it? What if I just have some other standard of value that I want to go by? And here we come back to the fundamentality of the alternative that Rand put her finger on. The only fundamental alternative in the universe is life or death, existence or non-existence. And this is where all of this began. By following the logic and making the integrations that we've made, we arrive at the conclusion that life is the standard of value and that a living thing pursues values for the most part in order to live. And that human beings should pursue values in order to live, because that's the only reason we need values, and it's the only reason that values are even made possible. Right? So with all of this, somebody wants to come along and say, well, I don't want to pursue my life-serving values. I want to give them up. Or I don't want to respect other people's right to pursue their life-serving values. I want to attack them and steal their values. So that's what the question amounts to, is can't I do that if I want to? Well, absolutely you can if you want to. You can give up your values. People do this all the time. Altruism tells people to do this, and a lot of people do it. But that doesn't change the objective standard of value, because the only standard of value that arises from observation and logic is life. And a living thing, a living human being, is an individual. He's got his own mind, his own body, his own life. And so the answer to the question of value to whom and for what remains here, that the only reason you need values is to make your life great, and and when you pursue values, those values should make your life great. If somebody wants to buck that, he has every right to do that, as long as his doing so doesn't violate the rights of others. So an altruist is perfectly free, should be perfectly free, to give up his values if he wants. It's not going to help him live. It's going to make his life rotten, but he's free to do that. But it doesn't change the objective standard of value. A predator is not free, or is not properly free, to attack other people or steal their stuff. He might want to, and he can want to all he wants. But because we who go by observation and logic, because we know that human beings have a right to act for themselves and to advance their lives, and that no one has a right to stop them, to use force to stop them from doing that, we are justified in taking the predator, if he attacks people, trying him, convicting him, and putting him in jail. So he can want to do that, and he can try to do it, but then we have a moral right to treat him accordingly if he does. So there's no problem with the altruist or the predator, at least in terms of the fundamental standard of value, the observation and logically derived standard of value is life. And if somebody wants to act against that, that's his business, as long as he doesn't violate the rights of others. But those desires don't wipe out the facts that give rise to life as the standard of value. They're just, desires don't, feelings don't affect facts that way. Number 4 is the last one that I'm going to address today. So a person can survive and be altruistic or predatory. So doesn't this invalidate the claim that life is the standard of value? And this is sort of related to the other ones, almost the same objection, but it's another angle on it. So I want to say a few words about this. Some people will say, well, look, if life is the standard of value and a person keeps himself alive and then does these other horrible things, or that I would call horrible, harming other people or sacrificing things so that his life is not what it could be, since he's still alive, isn't he still upholding life as the standard? He's still living. He hasn't violated that. He's still alive. And this is a failure to integrate. It's a failure. This kind of objection comes up from a failure to integrate. If we recognize the kind of thing that a human being is, the kind of animal that a human being is, we are matter and spirit, mind and body. We live not only for a few days, but for decades. We have all sorts of rich needs, both long range and wide range, and deep and complex. And living as a human being, or as Ayn Rand would put it, living as man, qua being Q-U-A, and it just means basically as this thing metaphysically is, as it is given its nature. If we live as a human being, fully as a human being, in order to do that, we have to take into account all of these aspects of human life, and it's really rich. So can someone remain alive and still take anti-life actions or be a predator? Yes, but he's not living the life of a human being. He's not living fully as the kind of animal that he is. So he can do that, but this does not change the fact that life is the standard of value, and the life of a given organism is the standard based on the requirements of that organism given its actual nature. If somebody wants to live a halfway life, if somebody wants to live a mitigated, not very interesting, not very exciting, not very spiritually fulfilling life, he can do that. There's nothing in the fabric of the universe that says he can't do that. It's just that he's only going to have that, the result is going to be a humdrum life. If you want to have a great life, you have to pay attention to the kind of animal that you are and to the actual requirements of your life given that kind of animal. And so there's another instance of a frozen abstraction here that can get in people's way, and that is this. You can't take this idea of survival or life and freeze that abstraction at the level of my heart is still beating or I'm still breathing, okay? Survival can mean, there are ways that you can use that term. He's alive can mean his heart is still beating. Or he has survived could mean that he got through the accident and he's mangled, but he's not dead, right? So there are ways that you can use that concept that way. But when we're talking about life in the context of morality and what kind of life we're trying to live, survival in this way, survival as man qua man, means survival given all of the requirements of human life, given the kind of animal it is. It basically means flourishing. It means surviving in the full, proper way that a human being lives. So don't freeze the abstraction of survival or life at the level of my heart is beating. Recognize that as human beings, we have very, very complex needs, and they're long range, they're wide range, and they're based on material and spiritual integration. So you can't just say the guy's heart is beating and ergo he's living. That's an equivocation on the concept of living. Okay, so that's it for the objections that I wanted to go over. I'm sure people have more. I'd be happy to address any additional objections in one of the episodes that we're going to do that's going to be a Q&A. But the point I want to close on today is that this whole discussion that we're having, like any good philosophic discussion, the principles involved are cumulative and integrative. So in order to understand these ideas, we're going into very abstract areas, and in order to understand them, you have to keep the concretes that we're looking at out in the world in mind the whole time. You have to enable your mind to integrate the various new data that we're bringing to bear on these examples and that the examples are giving rise to. there's an accumulation of information and knowledge that we're gaining here, and we've got to constantly integrate that in a non-contradictory way so that we can continue to understand facts based on all of this observation and initial logic and integration that we've done when we began with the question, what are values and why does man need them? So we've got to look at this in an accumulative way and in an integrative way. And if we don't, if someone doesn't do that, then he's not going to be able to follow any of this discussion. So it's really important to see this as philosophy. This is a philosophic inquiry, and we have to be willing to integrate and abstract and constantly check all of our thinking against the observation or the observable facts that gave rise to the entire inquiry. So keep your mind working, keep it integrating, keep thinking about these ideas. If something strikes you as not integrating, as something strikes you as problematic or as a contradiction or as a stolen concept or a frozen abstraction or anything like that you want to bring up and that you'd like me to address, send me an email or drop it in the comments here, and I will definitely address any of those kinds of objections in a future episode where we focus exclusively on Q&A. So that's it for today. Next week we will pick up where we left off. We're going to dive next week into what exactly does a human being need to do given the kind of animal that he is? What values does he need and what actions does he need to take in order to live a full and flourishing life? So hope you'll join me again next week. Until then, love your life.